God exist? Let's talk about it. This morning, we're going to look back in the book of Romans, and today we're going to look at chapter 1, where Paul is going to become a philosopher. Paul, part evangelist, part apologist, part rabbi, is also part philosopher. So if you have a Bible, check this out in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools." Well, this kind of a scenario with a global isolation because of this coronavirus spreading has maybe prompted several questions, even for Christians. Questions like, why are we even here? Why do we exist? Why did God create us? Was he lonely? And of course, the question is always there underneath it, if God created us, then who created him? Now, to understand this last question, we actually have an answer that is provided in the book of Romans, chapter 1. You see, to get to this point where we can actually start to understand where did God come from, or does he even exist, we've got to start at the other end. I remember a long time ago, I was hearing this presentation by someone, I think at a university, and he called himself an ex-Catholic atheist. And he said, "I don't believe in God, and I'm mad at him." That was sort of an attempt at humor, but it does actually relate to a lot of people's emotions, especially in the kind of struggle that we're facing right now. So let's just start with the other end. Now, he says that the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen. So let's start with this assumption. We know that we are here. If you can't say that, if you can't say, I know that I exist, I know that I'm here, then you can't really say anything. You might as well just stop the conversation. But if we can say, we know that we're here, we can also say, we know that we weren't here forever, right? I know that I had some beginning point about 34 years ago, and my parents also had a beginning, and their parents. And you can go back to the very beginning of humanity. You can go back to the beginning of our planet, of our solar system, and on and on and on. We know that we were not here forever. We came from something else. We also know that we didn't spawn ourselves into existence. We know that by the very laws that govern our entire cosmos, we could not have created ourselves. So however we got here, it was something outside of us. Now, hopefully, you can start to see the problem. You see, anything that we determine that was the source of our creation, we could then ask the same question about its source of creation. Can we just keep going on and on forever? Well, the answer is, of course, no, we can't. The fact that we exist right now in this moment, in the present, prevents the kind of infinite regress referred to as a Cantorian set. It was proven a long time ago by this mathematician to be impossible. So that means there is a fundamental stopping point where we have to step outside of space and time, and whatever lies beyond that would by definition be without a cause. So how do we describe this thing? Well, this entity, if we want to call it that, this entity, like we said, by definition, would be without a cause, and it would also be immensely powerful, just looking around at the universe and its expanse. And you could continue to get very detailed with this description of this entity, like the creative ability, the order, the reason, the logic. Take, for example, the fact that something like math works. Have you ever thought about that? How is it the case that a tiny little human being spiraling around on this planet, which is going immensely fast through or around the sun, but then through the universe, right? Our entire galaxy itself is moving at incredible speeds. So just imagine that tiny little speck on that little planet rolling around in the dark of the cosmos. Could be sitting in a room somewhere at a desk and scribbling some things that we call numbers on a piece of paper. And that calculation would then accurately describe and reflect the cosmos around that being. That's impressive. That's amazing. Some people even call that a miracle. It's called the applicability of math. Why does math work? Well, that tells us something about our origin. The fundamental origin of us, by definition, is ordered, structured, logical because of things like math and like the laws that are immutable around us. We could also describe this entity as being elegant because the solutions that we end up coming to are a lot simpler than some of the original things that we come up with. For example, a long time ago, when people were under the assumption that the sun and the other planets and celestial bodies orbited the Earth. This is called a geocentric model of the universe, where everything moved around it. This concept, while maybe intuitive at first, when you go out and look outside, it does seem like everything's moving around us. It became harder and harder to project in a model. Right? And so astronomers would come up with these increasingly complex, really interesting elliptical models to try to match how the movement of these planets and other things were not always the same. They would come in and out, and they would move in these strange patterns. And then this guy named Copernicus came up with a different idea. He said, what if the Earth wasn't the center, but what if the sun was the center of this solar system? And he came up with a heliocentric model. And amazingly, it was a lot simpler than what other guys had been coming up with before him. So the closer we get to correctly mapping reality, the simpler it seems to become. Of course, we can remember, obviously, Einstein's E equals mc squared equation, which is brilliant and yet also elegant. Now, what we're actually doing here is trying to describe that fundamental origin that we know must, by definition, be outside of us and be outside of space and time. So it would be without a cause, immensely powerful, ordered, logical, elegant, and we could go on and on. Now, what we're actually doing here is just describing God without calling him God. See, scientists today that want to call the creator quantum weirdness, or they might say the quantum field that began everything, that's beyond everything, or other kinds of things like, using scientific words to try to describe everything, doesn't eliminate the fact that they are, of course, talking about God. They just don't want to call the thing that they are talking about God, because that gives some other implications. And this is exactly what Paul is describing in this chapter of Romans. He says, that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has already showed it to them. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, the more we look at the world, the more we look into the limits of space, or the tiny even microscopic elements that make up and comprise everything, the more we actually begin to describe God. We can see him everywhere and in everything. And the Bible says that there are no true unbelievers. He says they knew God, because that when they knew God, that means they knew that this originator, this creator was there. That, of course, wasn't the problem. The problem was that they didn't glorify him. He says they knew God, Romans 1:21. They glorified him not as God. So they wanted to say, look at all this amazing stuff out there and how beautiful and elegant and creative it is. And we're going to describe it, but we're not going to glorify the creator. We're not going to give personage to this creator, which is, again, it's really silly to say that whatever started everything and all of this doesn't have any person. Right? Why is that silly? Because we're persons. So we're saying this non-person, immensely powerful, structured, beautiful, elegant, creative, designed all of this, gave us who we are. So we have personhood, but then we don't want to ascribe personhood to the creator. See, that's what Paul is warning. He says, these people did not glorify him as God. They wanted him to be something else. And then, of course, he says, neither were thankful. It's really interesting. You might have read at some point the rest of chapter 1, where all of the sinful details of a civilization go in this kind of spiraling down pattern where it gets worse and worse until society itself unravels. And look how it begins. It begins with unthankfulness. In a person, in a village, in a family, in a city, in a nation, it always begins with this point. We see it, we acknowledge it's there, but we don't want to be thankful. We don't want to be thankful to this God who made us. Instead, these people became vain in their own imaginations. So they wanted to go to great detail and depth and mathematically, scientifically, poetically, philosophically describing reality without the person of God at the front, so that they don't have to be thankful to someone. They don't have to glorify that person. They want to lift themselves up, he says, in their own imagination, and then their foolish heart becomes darkened by it. And that just means they become blinded to reality. Because it is the case that God does exist, that would mean that when a person gets further and further away from acknowledging him, they are simultaneously stepping further and further away from reality, that which is real. And it creates a kind of derangement, a delusion. And they begin to profess themselves to be wise, verse 22 says, and then they become, ironically, foolish. Verse 23 goes on, he says, they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like everything that we see, animals, people. We don't have any problem in our society glorifying each other or ourselves, but we don't want to glorify or be thankful to God. And that's the beginning of the end for a civilization. So in a struggle or in a trial, it's very easy to start asking some of these deeper questions. And we can start by saying, is God really there? And the answer is yes. And we know it. You know it. Not only do you see it in the world around you, but you know it deep down in your own intuition. He's put it in your heart, his own existence. You know, the Bible never even argues that God is there. It just describes him because he is, and he is a faithful rewarder of those who seek him. I hope today you spend your time seeking God and desiring to know him more and to be thankful that he's given you life. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.